there is a name that echoes through the age of sail, like cannon fire across still water, felt before it is fully heard, arriving with a weight that the centuries have done nothing to diminish. That name is Bartholomew Roberts, and if you have never heard it spoken with the reverence it deserves, then consider this your introduction to the most successful pirate who ever lived. Not the most famous, not the most romanticized, but the most successful, by almost any measure history cares to apply. In an era when pirates were plentiful and the seas were lawless enough to make a man's ambitions feel limitless, Bartholomew Roberts stood apart. Where others captured a handful of ships and called it a career, Roberts captured over 400. Where others lasted a season or two before the noose or the ocean claimed them, Roberts terrorized 3 entire ocean basins: the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the waters off the coast of West Africa, for nearly 3 years without pause. He was methodical where others were reckless, disciplined where others dissolved into chaos, elegant even in a world that had little use for the word. He wore silk damask coats into battle. He drank tea while other pirates drank themselves senseless on rum. He wrote constitutions for his crews, actual governing documents, signed and agreed upon, guaranteeing compensation for injury, democratic voting rights, and a fair division of plunder. In the early 18th century, at the height of the so-called Golden Age of piracy, Bartholomew Roberts was running something that looked, from certain angles, almost like a republic, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. As with all great stories, this one begins quietly. He was born around 682 in a small Welsh village called Casnoed Bach, a name that translates with fitting modesty to Little Newcastle. The son of unremarkable parents in an unremarkable place, the boy who would one day be called Black Bart came into the world with no particular promise of legend. Wales in the late 17th century was a place where the sea was always visible from the hills, where fishing villages clung to the coastline, and where young men with restless spirits often found their way to the docks. Roberts was one of them. He went to sea young, as many did, and spent the better part of 2 decades as a working sailor, legitimate, law-abiding, climbing the slow and unglamorous ladder of maritime life. By his late 30s, he had achieved the rank of second mate aboard a slave-trading vessel. It was honest work by the standards of the time, though the trade itself was among the darkest enterprises the era produced. Roberts was a professional, a skilled navigator, a man of experience and capability who had simply never been handed the circumstances that his talents might have demanded. Then, in the summer of 1709, those circumstances arrived, though not in any form he would have chosen. His ship, the Princess, was anchored off the coast of West Africa near the island of Anamabo when it was seized by a pirate captain named Howell Davis. Davis, the fellow Welshman, recognized immediately that Roberts was no ordinary sailor. He was sharp. He was observant. He understood the sea and the stars and the subtle politics of men confined to wooden ships. Davis pressed him into service, a common enough practice, but he also kept him close, made him something of a confidant. Roberts resisted at first. He had lived a lawful life. He was not, by temperament, a brigand, but he was also a practical man, and practical men, when they find themselves at sea surrounded by pirates, tend to adapt. Within weeks, something in Roberts had shifted. Perhaps it was the freedom. Perhaps it was the sudden absence of deference to men less capable than himself. Perhaps, as he reportedly said when asked about his decision to embrace piracy, it was simply this: in an honest service there is thin commons, low wages and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. He had found his philosophy. He had only to find his moment. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. Howell Davis was killed in an ambush in June of 1719, shot dead on the island of Principe before the year was out. The crew, suddenly leaderless and in need of someone who could navigate them out of danger, turned to Roberts. He had been a pirate for mere weeks. He accepted the captaincy without hesitation. He would hold it for the rest of his life, and what a life it would become. Over the next 3 years, Bartholomew Roberts would carve a path of breathtaking audacity across the Atlantic world, attacking naval convoys, blockading entire ports, humiliating governors, and accumulating a record of captured vessels that no pirate before or since has come close to matching. He would write codes of conduct that some historians have called more enlightened than the laws of the nations pursuing him. He would dress for battle like a man attending a formal occasion. He would become, in the eyes of merchants and monarchs alike, the most feared figure on the open sea. But behind every legend is a human being, complicated, contradictory, shaped by circumstance and choice in equal measure. That is the man we are here to understand. In the segments that follow, we will trace Roberts' voyages across 3 oceans, explore the remarkable society he built aboard his ships, and examine the world that both produced him and ultimately could not contain him. Settle in. The story has only just begun. To understand Bartholomew Roberts, you must first understand the world that made him possible. Because Roberts did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from one of the most extraordinary and turbulent periods in maritime history. A window of roughly 30 years, spanning from the late 1680s to the early 1720s, that historians have come to call the Golden Age of piracy. And while that name carries a certain romantic shimmer, the reality of that age was, as realities tend to be, far more complicated than the romance suggests. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were a time of almost continuous warfare among the great European powers: England, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic. These nations spent decades locked in shifting alliances and bitter conflicts, each one pouring enormous resources into building and maintaining naval fleets. And to supplement those fleets, they relied heavily on a practice that occupied a peculiar legal gray zone: privateering. A privateer was, in essence, a licensed pirate. A ship captain granted official permission, called a letter of marque, to attack and plunder the vessels of enemy nations. It was piracy with paperwork, piracy with a flag, piracy that served the interests of a crown and was therefore called something else entirely. The problem, and it was a significant one, was that wars eventually end, and when they did, these skilled, experienced, heavily armed men who had spent years learning to take ships by force suddenly found themselves without a paycheck and without a purpose. The Royal Navy, bloated during wartime, shed sailors by the thousands during peacetime. Those men knew the sea. They knew how to fight. They knew the shipping lanes, the seasonal winds, the hidden anchorages. What they did not know was what to do with themselves when the legitimate work dried up. Some went back to fishing villages. Some found berths on merchant vessels, accepting brutal conditions and miserable wages for the privilege of honest work. And some, a significant and consequential sum, looked out at the same ocean they had always sailed and decided they would simply continue doing what they had always done, only now without the paperwork. The Caribbean was, at this moment in history, the perfect incubator for what followed. It was a region of extraordinary wealth: sugar, tobacco, indigo, and silver, moving in vast quantities through sea lanes that were difficult to patrol and impossible to fully control. The islands were numerous, the coastlines were labyrinthine, and the colonial governments were understaffed, corrupt, and often more interested in looking the other way, particularly when pirates spent their plunder in local taverns and markets, than in mounting serious enforcement operations. Nassau, in the Bahamas, became the unofficial capital of pirate society in the early 1700s, a place where wanted men could find camaraderie, resupply, and a certain anarchic freedom that the structured world of legitimate society could not offer. It is worth pausing here to examine what pirate society actually looked like in practice, because popular imagination has done it considerable disservice. The image of pirates as purely chaotic, drunken, ungovernable mobs is, at best, a partial truth. Pirate ships, particularly successful ones, required the same basic operational competence as any other vessel. Someone had to know navigation, someone had to manage provisions, someone had to maintain the rigging, the guns, the hull, and someone had to keep order among men who were, by definition, already disposed toward a certain disregard for authority. What evolved, remarkably, was a form of democracy, crude and imperfect, yes, but democracy nonetheless. Most pirate crews operated under written agreements called articles, drawn up before a voyage and signed by every crew member. These documents laid out the rules of conduct aboard the ship, the division of plunder, the penalties for misconduct, and, crucially, the rights of the crew to vote on matters of collective importance, including the election of their captain. A pirate captain, unlike the captain of a naval vessel, served at the pleasure of his men. He could be voted out if he proved incompetent, cowardly, or unfair in the distribution of spoils. The quartermaster, an elected position, served as a check on the captain's authority, managing the day-to-day affairs of the crew and ensuring that no single man accumulated too much power. Scholars who have studied these articles have noted, with some astonishment, that they often provided more protections and more equitable treatment to ordinary sailors than the legitimate naval and merchant services of the era. A sailor aboard a Royal Navy vessel had almost no rights. He could be flogged at the captain's discretion. His wages could be withheld. He had no say in the ship's course or conduct. A sailor who signed a pirate ship's articles, by contrast, could expect a guaranteed share of any plunder, compensation for wounds sustained in battle, and a genuine voice in the governance of the ship. This does not make piracy noble. The violence was real, and the victims, the merchants, the fishermen, the passengers whose ships were taken and whose lives were sometimes brutally disrupted, suffered genuinely. But it does complicate the simple story of pirates as purely destructive forces operating outside of any social logic. In many ways, pirate ships were an extreme and illegal expression of grievances that were widely felt among the working poor of the maritime world. The sense that the powerful took everything and left nothing, that honest work offered no dignity and no reward, that the system was rigged and the only rational response was to step outside it entirely. Into this world, this specific, combustible, historically peculiar world, came Bartholomew Roberts, and what he found there, once Hal Davis was dead and the captaincy fell into his hands, was not chaos. It was raw material. His first act as captain was not to celebrate. It was to plan. Davis had been killed in a Portuguese ambush on the island of Principe, lured ashore under the pretense of diplomacy, and shot when he arrived. The crew was grieving and furious, anchored in dangerous waters with enemies on the island above them. A lesser man might have ordered an immediate retreat. Roberts ordered an attack. He led a party ashore that same night and took his revenge on the settlement, not indiscriminately, but with a focused ferocity that sent a message about the kind of captain he intended to be. This was not a man who absorbed loss passively. This was not a man who flinched. Then they sailed. And here is where the scope of what Roberts would accomplish begins to come into focus, because in his very first months as captain, he did something that astonished even his own crew. He took his small, newly inherited ship and sailed it across the Atlantic to the coast of Brazil. This was not a short journey. This was not a cautious one. It was a declaration that Roberts intended to operate on a scale that most pirates had never even imagined. The Caribbean was crowded with competition. The established shipping lanes were well patrolled. Roberts was looking for a theater large enough to contain his ambitions. He found it off the coast of Bahia, where he encountered a Portuguese treasure fleet, a convoy of 42 ships escorted by 2 warships waiting at anchor. 42 ships, with 2 naval escorts. Any rational calculation of risk would have counseled patience, caution, perhaps the selection of a single straggler at the convoy's edge. Roberts made a different calculation. He sailed directly into the fleet, single ship against 44, and demanded that the Portuguese admiral come aboard his vessel to identify which ship carried the richest cargo. The admiral complied, whether out of shock, confusion, or a pragmatic assessment of his options in the face of such extraordinary audacity. The man rowed across to Roberts's ship and answered the question. Roberts thanked him, located the vessel in question, a ship called the Sagrada Familia, carrying 40 guns and an enormous quantity of sugar, skins, tobacco and gold, and took it, right there in the harbor, in front of 41 other ships and 2 naval escorts. Then he sailed away. It is the kind of story that, if you encountered it in a novel, you might set the book down and question the author's commitment to plausibility. But it happened, it is documented, and it established, in a single audacious afternoon, exactly who Bartholomew Roberts was and what the next 3 years of maritime history were going to look like. The world he had been born into, the world of desperate sailors, corrupted colonies, legal grey zones, and oceans too vast to properly govern, had handed him an opportunity, and Roberts, who had spent 40 years waiting for one, was not about to let it pass. He was barely 3 months into his captaincy. He had barely begun. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself with volume. It does not need to shout. It does not need to threaten at every turn or remind the room of its presence with constant displays of force. It simply exists, steady, legible, and undeniable, and everything around it organizes itself accordingly. Bartholomew Roberts had that kind of power, and nowhere was it more evident than in the Caribbean, where he arrived in late 1719 and proceeded, over the following months, to conduct himself less like a wanted criminal and more like a sovereign operating in territory he had already, in his own mind, claimed. He came north from the Brazilian coast flush with success, his crew emboldened, his reputation, still young but already remarkable, spreading ahead of him through the informal channels by which news moved in that era. Sailors talking in port taverns, merchants filing nervous reports with colonial governors, naval officers writing increasingly urgent dispatches that all carried some version of the same message. There was a new captain on the water. He was unlike the others. Take note, the Caribbean in 1720 was not, despite what the word pirate might conjure, a place of simple, uncomplicated plunder. It was a complex geopolitical theater. The major European powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, all maintained colonial presences across the island chains and the adjacent mainland coasts, and all were engaged in the perpetual, exhausting project of protecting their shipping interests while undermining everyone else's. The sea lanes were contested, the ports were watched, or at least nominally watched, and the pirates who operated in this environment had to be, above all else, adaptable, capable of reading the political weather as accurately as they read the actual weather, and adjusting their movements accordingly. Roberts was exceptionally good at this. He moved through the Caribbean with a fluency that suggested not just seamanship but something closer to strategic intelligence. He understood which ports were sympathetic, which governors were susceptible to bribery, and which shipping lanes were sufficiently remote that a vessel could be taken without witnesses reaching the nearest colonial authority for days. He understood the rhythms of merchant traffic, when the sugar convoys moved, when the slave ships crossed, when the seasonal winds made certain passages slow and predictable and therefore vulnerable. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, a professional, But what truly distinguished Roberts in this period, what set him apart from every other captain operating in the same waters, was not his tactical skill. It was his philosophy of governance, because Roberts, uniquely among pirates of his era, believed that a ship was only as powerful as the society it contained, and he set about building that society with the same deliberate intentionality that a founder might bring to a new institution. The instrument of this project was the Articles, the written code of conduct that every man aboard Roberts's ships was required to sign before the vessel sailed. Articles were not unique to Roberts. Most pirate crews of the Golden Age operated under some version of them, but Roberts's Articles were remarkable in their detail, their specificity, and the genuine social vision they encoded. They were not merely rules, they were a statement of values. The document covered an extraordinary range of situations and conduct. Every man aboard had an equal vote in affairs of consequence. Every man had an equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors at any time, except in cases of scarcity. The plunder was to be divided according to a fixed schedule, the captain receiving 2 shares, the quartermaster, master, boatswain, and gunner receiving 1 1/4 each, all other officers 1 1/4, and ordinary crew members 1 share apiece. This was not generosity for its own sake. It was social engineering. By making the distribution of wealth transparent and predictable, Roberts eliminated one of the primary sources of resentment and mutiny that plagued other crews, the suspicion that someone, somewhere, was getting more than their fair share. Compensation for injury was codified with a specificity that would not look out of place in a modern labor agreement. The loss of a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, a left arm 500, a right leg 500, a left leg 400, an eye or a finger 100. These sums were guaranteed, paid out of the common stock before any other division of plunder, ensuring that a man who sacrificed part of his body in the ship's service would not find himself discarded and destitute when the fighting was done. In the Royal Navy, no such protections existed. In the merchant service, no such protections existed. On Bartholomew Roberts' ships, they were written law. Other articles addressed the more intimate logistics of communal life. Gambling with cards or dice for money was prohibited, not on moral grounds particularly, but because it generated conflict, and conflict was operationally costly. Women were not permitted aboard. The reasoning here was less about propriety than about the practical reality that romantic competition among men in a confined space produced the kind of violence that consumed a crew from within. Lights and candles were to be extinguished at 8 o'clock in the evening. Any man who wished to drink after that hour was to do so on the open deck. Musicians had the right to rest on Sundays. Every other day they could be required to play. There was a line in the Articles about desertion and cowardice in battle that carried the most severe penalties, death or marooning. But there was also a line, perhaps the most telling of all, that addressed the resolution of personal disputes between crew members. Fighting aboard ship was strictly forbidden. If 2 men had a quarrel serious enough that it required settlement by force, they were to go ashore on the next available island and conduct a formal duel. Pistols first, and if both men missed, then swords, and the first blood drawn would settle the matter. The ship itself was to remain a space of enforced civility. Read these articles carefully, and what you find is not the rulebook of a criminal enterprise. What you find is the founding document of a community, one built on the recognition that men living in close quarters under extreme stress, with few of the social structures that ordinarily regulate behavior, needed clear rules and genuine buy-in to function as anything other than a mob. Roberts understood something that many legitimate authorities of his era did not: that order imposed purely by fear is fragile, that it collapses the moment the fear wavers, and that genuine, durable order requires a measure of consent. He got that consent, His crews, by all accounts, were unusually cohesive, unusually disciplined, and unusually effective. Men who sailed with Roberts once tended to sail with him again. Men who were captured from other vessels and given the choice of joining his crew often chose to join. Not always, not universally, but often enough to suggest that what Roberts was offering, structure, fairness, purpose, and the genuine possibility of substantial reward, was genuinely appealing to men who had experienced the alternative. And the alternative, it bears repeating, was grim. The legitimate maritime world of the early 18th century was one of the most brutal working environments in existence. A common sailor aboard a British merchant vessel earned wages so low that even a modest injury could tip him into destitution. He was subject to the absolute authority of his captain, who could administer corporal punishment at will and withhold pay for infractions real or invented. He was fed poorly, housed below decks in spaces that were dark, damp, and perpetually cold, and offered no protection whatsoever if he was injured, fell ill, or found himself discharged at a foreign port with no money and no prospects. The life expectancy of a working sailor was short. The rewards were minimal. The indignities were constant. Against that backdrop, Roberts's articles were not just rules. They were a recruitment pitch. It was during this Caribbean period that Roberts also developed what might be called his signature operational style, a combination of speed, surprise, and psychological pressure that he deployed with remarkable consistency. He rarely needed to fight pitched battles, though he was entirely capable of doing so. More often, he relied on reputation. A ship that saw Roberts's flags, and he flew several, each one carrying its own elaborate symbolism, frequently struck its own colors before the first shot was fired. The calculation was simple. Resistance meant a hard fight and an uncertain outcome. Surrender meant the loss of cargo, but the preservation of life. And Roberts, who was not by nature a sadist, generally treated cooperative prisoners with a certain businesslike courtesy. This restraint was itself a strategy. A captain known to massacre surrendering crews quickly finds that no one surrenders anymore, that every ship fights to the last, because there is nothing to be gained by stopping. Roberts preferred a reputation for measured, contractual violence. Attack us, and we will destroy you. Cooperate, and you will be released, shaken but largely intact. It made him more efficient. It made him more feared, paradoxically, not less. Because a man who is precise about his violence is somehow more terrifying than one who is merely indiscriminate. His flags made the philosophy visual. One of his most famous, designed by Roberts himself, according to several accounts, depicted him standing on two skulls, labeled ABH and AMH, representing a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head. This was not abstract symbolism. It was a direct and pointed message to the governors of Barbados and Martinique, both of whom had organized anti-piracy patrols that had caused Roberts significant inconvenience. He was telling them, in the most visible language available, that he knew who his enemies were, and that the accounting was not finished. Another flag showed him standing alongside death itself, both holding an hourglass. A reminder to any observer that time, for everyone, was finite. He was not merely sailing. He was communicating, managing his image, his enemy's fear, and his own crew's morale through every tool available to him, including the flag snapping at his masthead as he bore down on yet another vessel that had not yet decided whether to run. By the middle of 1720, the Caribbean knew his name. Governors wrote to London requesting reinforcements. Merchants lobbied for naval escorts. Insurance rates on Caribbean shipping, already high, climbed further. And Roberts, dressed in his damask coat, drinking his tea, consulting his charts with the unhurried focus of a man who believed completely in the rightness of what he was doing, continued his work. He was building something. He was not entirely sure, perhaps, what to call it. But it was real, and it was his, and for the moment, nothing on the ocean could stop it. There is a moment in the arc of every extraordinary life when the subject of that life reaches the absolute summit of what they are capable of, when every skill accumulated over years of experience, every lesson absorbed from failure and success alike, every instinct sharpened by necessity converges into a single sustained period of almost incomprehensible achievement. For some, that summit lasts a day. For some, a season. For Bartholomew Roberts, it lasted the better part of 2 years, stretched across 2 continents and an ocean, and produced a record of maritime dominance that the world had never seen before and has not seen since. It began with a decision. A characteristically bold, characteristically logical, characteristically Roberts kind of decision. By late 1720, the Caribbean, vast as it was, had become, in a certain sense, too small. Not in the literal geographic sense. The island chains stretched for hundreds of miles. The shipping was plentiful, and there was no shortage of targets for a captain willing to move between the major lanes. But the Caribbean had also become, in the months since Roberts arrived, increasingly attentive to his presence. Governors who had previously treated piracy as a manageable nuisance were beginning to treat it as an emergency. Naval patrols, while still inadequate, were becoming more frequent. The informal networks of sympathetic port officials and cooperative merchants who had previously turned blind eyes were coming under pressure from London and from one another to demonstrate some semblance of law enforcement effort. Roberts read these signs the way a skilled navigator reads a shifting sky, not with alarm, but with the calm, practical recognition that conditions were changing and that adaptation was required. He had been moving through the Caribbean for months. He had taken ships in large numbers. He had made his name. Now it was time to move the theater of operations, and to move it in a direction that no pirate of his era had attempted with anything approaching the ambition Roberts had in mind. He turned east. He pointed his fleet. For by this point, Roberts was commanding not one ship, but several. Prizes fitted out and crewed from his growing organization, toward the Atlantic, toward West Africa, toward the Slave Coast. The decision was brilliant in its strategic logic. West Africa, in the early 18th century, was the site of one of the largest and most lucrative commercial operations in the world, the Atlantic slave trade. Portuguese, British, French, and Dutch trading companies maintained fortified posts along the coast, called factories, where they conducted the acquisition and transport of enslaved people across the Middle Passage to the plantations of the Americas. The ships involved in this trade were substantial vessels, well provisioned for long ocean crossings, and carrying considerable value not just in their human cargo but in the trade goods, gold, ivory, textiles, weapons, used to conduct business on the African coast. The slave coast was, from a purely piratical economic perspective, extraordinarily attractive. It was also, from an enforcement perspective, extraordinarily remote. The colonial governors who were beginning to organize against Roberts in the Caribbean had no jurisdiction on the African coast. The African trading companies maintained small armed presences at their shore installations, but these were oriented toward the land, toward managing relations with local rulers and protecting their factories from rival European powers, not toward naval operations at sea. The Royal Navy had almost no presence in West African waters. A pirate captain operating off the slave coast was operating in a space that was, for all practical purposes, ungoverned. Roberts understood this. He had navigated these waters before, as a legitimate sailor in the slave trade. He knew the coastline, the seasonal winds, the anchorages, the patterns of traffic. He was not sailing into the unknown. He was sailing into familiar territory with new intent, and the combination of geographic knowledge and operational experience made him, in this theater, nearly unstoppable. He arrived on the West African coast in early 1721, and what followed over the next several months constitutes the most astonishing sustained stretch of his career. Working his way along the coast from Senegal southward, Roberts and his fleet fell upon the shipping lanes with a systematic thoroughness that suggested not random predation but something closer to a planned harvesting operation. Ships were taken in rapid succession. Portuguese traders, British slavers, French vessels, independent merchants. Some were plundered and released. Some were taken as prizes and added to the fleet. Some were stripped of their most useful elements, guns, rigging, provisions, navigational instruments, and then burned or sunk, their crews set ashore or transferred to other vessels. The numbers accumulated with a speed that, even now, reading through the historical record, produces a kind of disbelief. In a single morning off the coast of West Africa, Roberts took 11 ships at anchor in a Portuguese convoy. 11 vessels, in a matter of hours, without anything that could meaningfully be called a battle. The captains of those ships, confronted with Roberts' fleet appearing out of the early light, made the same calculation that so many had made before, that there was nothing to be gained from fighting a man who had already demonstrated, repeatedly and conclusively, what happened to those who tried. They surrendered. Roberts took what he wanted. He moved on. It was at this point in his career, the summer and autumn of 1721, on the West African coast, with his fleet at its largest and his operational tempo at its highest, that Roberts stood at what can only be described as the apex of an empire. Not an empire in the formal sense. He held no territory, flew no recognized flag, owed allegiance to no crown, but in the practical sense, in the sense that matters when measuring power. He controlled the most productive maritime raiding operation in the history of piracy, commanding multiple ships, hundreds of men, and the genuine documented fear of governments on both sides of the Atlantic. His flagship at this period was a vessel he had taken earlier and fitted out to his own specifications, which he called the Royal Fortune, a name he would use for more than one ship over the course of his career, with a consistency that suggested he regarded it less as a ship's name and more as a title, a brand, the name of his operation rather than merely a vessel. The Royal Fortune was a large, powerful warship, heavily gunned, fast enough to run down most merchant vessels, and fitted below decks with the particular combination of comfort and functionality that Roberts preferred. He was not a man who lived squalidly if he could avoid it. He kept his cabin ordered. He dressed well. He maintained in the middle of the Atlantic a standard of personal presentation that his contemporaries, both those who feared him and those who sailed with him, found striking precisely because it so thoroughly contradicted every expectation of what a pirate should look like. He drank tea. This detail appears in multiple independent accounts, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment because of what it reveals. Rum was the currency of the pirate world, not just a beverage but a social institution, the lubricant of camaraderie, the reward for a hard day's work, the medium through which men in brutal circumstances managed the accumulated weight of what they were doing and what was being done to them. Most pirate captains drank heavily. Many drank ruinously. Roberts chose tea. He was not, by most accounts, moralistic about his crew's drinking. The articles permitted alcohol, regulated only by the practical concern of maintaining fighting efficiency. But for himself, he preferred clarity. He preferred to be, at all moments, the most conscious man in the room. It was this clarity, this relentless self-possession, that enabled him to manage the increasingly complex logistics of a multi-ship operation across thousands of miles of ocean. Because commanding a pirate fleet, even a disciplined one operating under clear articles, was not a simple administrative matter. It required constant attention to the condition of the ships, which needed careening, the laborious process of hauling a vessel onto its side on a beach to scrape the accumulated growth from its hull at regular intervals. It required managing the provisioning of hundreds of men across an environment where legitimate supply was impossible, and every meal had to be either captured or negotiated. It required adjudicating disputes, maintaining morale through periods of poor luck or bad weather, replacing men lost to injury and illness, and constantly evaluating the shifting risk landscape. Which shipping lanes were now too well patrolled, which anchorages were safe, which colonial ports might be approached for trade, and which had received intelligence about his whereabouts. He managed all of this consistently. Over 2 years on the West African coast, he managed it so effectively that the historical record of his operations reads less like piracy than like logistics, a masterclass in maintaining a complex mobile organization in an environment specifically designed to make such organizations fail. There were, of course, moments of genuine violence. Roberts was not a peaceful man operating a peaceful enterprise. Ships that resisted were attacked, and the attacks were ferocious. At the Portuguese island of São Tomé, a conflict with local forces resulted in deaths on both sides. In encounters with slave ships, vessels crewed by men who understood, better than most, that their cargo made them extraordinarily attractive targets, and who therefore sometimes chose to fight. The violence could be sustained and bloody. Roberts did not shy from these engagements. He led them from the front, as his crew expected, and as his own temperament demanded, dressed always in that remarkable coat, pistols at his chest on a silk sling, sword at his side, the most visible man on the most dangerous part of the deck. But what is perhaps most striking about this period, what gives the story of Roberts on the West African coast its particular texture and weight, is the degree to which he remained, through all of it, fundamentally himself. He did not become cruel as his power grew. He did not become paranoid or erratic, as leaders sometimes do when the stakes climb high enough. He remained disciplined, methodical, possessed of that peculiar, steady confidence that had marked him from the first days of his captaincy. The confidence of a man who had looked at the world, assessed it honestly, made his choices with full awareness of their consequences, and decided that he could live with who he was becoming. His crews, hundreds of men drawn from dozens of nations and dozens of different backgrounds, Welsh and English and African and Caribbean and Portuguese and Dutch, sailed under him with a cohesion that most naval commanders of the era would have envied. They were not innocent men. They had chosen this life with knowledge of its costs, but they were, in the specific context of Roberts' command, something that is genuinely remarkable in any era, a functional community, held together by a written compact, a shared purpose, and their confidence in the man who led them. By the end of 1721, the count of vessels taken under Bartholomew Roberts' command had passed 300. It would keep climbing. The governments of Europe were, at last, beginning to understand the scale of what they were dealing with, and beginning to organize a response that would, for the first time, be proportionate to the threat. The reckoning was coming. Roberts could not have known exactly when or from which direction, but a man of his intelligence, reading the political weather as carefully as he always had, must have sensed that the world was shifting, that the space he had carved out, by will and audacity, and sheer extraordinary competence, was beginning, at its edges, to close. He kept sailing. What else was there to do? The ocean was still wide, the ships were still out there, and Bartholomew Roberts, at the summit of everything he had built, was not a man who stopped. Empires are slow to anger. This is not a weakness, exactly. It is the nature of large, complex systems that they absorb disruption for longer than smaller ones would, that they possess a certain inertia born of size and institutional momentum that makes them difficult to redirect quickly. But when an empire does finally turn its full attention toward a problem, when the accumulated weight of political will and military resource is at last focused on a single point, the effect can be overwhelming. And by the close of 1721, the British Empire, the most powerful maritime nation on earth, had turned its attention, with gathering seriousness, toward Bartholomew Roberts. It had taken longer than it should have. That much was acknowledged, with varying degrees of embarrassment, by the officials involved. The Caribbean governors had been writing to London for months, their dispatches growing progressively more urgent in tone, each one cataloguing fresh losses, fresh humiliations, fresh evidence that the situation on the Atlantic sea lanes had moved well beyond the category of manageable nuisance into something that threatened the fundamental economic architecture of the British colonial project. Sugar, tobacco, slaves. The commodities that underwrote the prosperity of the empire's western possessions moved by sea, and the sea, in increasing stretches of it, belonged to Roberts. Insurance rates had climbed to levels that made some merchant ventures economically irrational. Captains were refusing certain routes. Investors were growing nervous. The political machinery in London, as political machinery tends to do, had responded with the particular combination of alarm and procedural deliberateness that characterizes governments confronting problems they wish they had addressed earlier. There were committees, there were reports, there were earnest discussions about the proper deployment of naval assets across an ocean that was simultaneously being asked to serve as a commercial highway, a military frontier, and an enforced boundary between competing colonial empires. The Royal Navy was stretched. It was always stretched. The post-war reductions that had sent so many sailors into unemployment, and some of those sailors into piracy, had also reduced the fleet's capacity to patrol the enormous expanses it was theoretically responsible for. But by late 1720, a decision had been made. A specific decision about a specific man, executed with specific resources. The Admiralty dispatched to West Africa a naval squadron under the command of Captain Challoner Ogle, aboard the 50-gun warship HMS Swallow. Ogle was an experienced officer. Not brilliant, not particularly inspired, but competent, thorough, and possessed of exactly the kind of patient, institutional determination that the situation required. He was not sent to negotiate. He was not sent to offer amnesty, as some previous efforts to reduce piracy had attempted. He was sent to find Bartholomew Roberts and destroy him. It is worth understanding what this moment meant in the broader history of the era. Because the campaign against Roberts was not simply a law enforcement operation, it was a statement of imperial priority, a declaration that the British Crown was prepared to commit genuine military resources to the suppression of piracy in a sustained, systematic way. Previous efforts had been episodic, underfunded, and often undermined by the same colonial corruption that had allowed piracy to flourish in the first place. This was different. This was an acknowledgement, at the highest levels of British government, that the golden age of piracy, that remarkable, chaotic, 30-year experiment in maritime lawlessness, needed to end. And that ending it required, above all else, ending Roberts. He was, by this point, that significant, not merely a wanted criminal, but a symbol of everything that the established order most feared about what happened when men decided they were no longer bound by its rules. The pirates who had come before him, Blackbeard, Bellamy, Hornigold, had been colorful, dramatic, and in their various ways, dangerous. But none of them had demonstrated what Roberts had demonstrated, that piracy, properly organized, could be sustained not just for a season or two, but indefinitely, across multiple ocean theaters, at a scale that genuinely threatened imperial commerce. If Roberts could not be stopped, other men would look at what he had done and draw conclusions. The empire understood this. It moved accordingly. Meanwhile, Roberts continued to operate. He was not unaware of the attention being paid to him. His intelligence networks, the captured sailors, the sympathetic port contacts, the decoded patterns of naval movement, were sophisticated enough to give him a general sense of the forces being organized against him. But intelligence, however good, has limits. And Roberts, in this final period of his career, was operating under pressures that were beginning, for the first time, to tell. His fleet had grown large and complex enough that it was becoming difficult to manage. The tensions inherent in any community of men living under extreme and sustained stress, tensions that his articles had done so much to manage, were beginning to surface in ways that the articles could not fully contain. There were disputes. There were defections. There were moments of indiscipline that Roberts, in earlier and simpler times, would not have had to contend with. Some of his most capable officers had been killed or lost. Some of his most reliable ships had been taken as prizes or destroyed in engagements. The organization was still formidable, still capable, on any given day, of taking ships that would have been impossible for lesser commanders to approach. But it was showing the first signs of the strain that comes to every enterprise when it has been operating at full intensity for too long. There were also the personal losses. Not all of Roberts's enemies were naval officers or colonial governors. Some of them were the sea itself, the storms, the shoals, the fevers and infections that moved through ships' crews with a democratic indifference to rank or reputation. Men he had known for years. Men who had signed his articles in the early days and sailed with him across 2 oceans, were dying of disease on the West African coast, where the climate was punishing even to those who had grown accustomed to the tropics. The Royal Fortune had required repeated repairs. The chain of operational continuity that Roberts had maintained through sheer force of will and managerial genius was showing hairline fractures. And yet he did not stop. The accounts from this period, drawn from the journals of prisoners, the depositions of captured sailors, the reports of colonial officials who encountered his fleet and survived to describe it, consistently portray a man who had lost none of his operational focus, none of his personal composure, none of that remarkable self-possession that had defined him from the beginning. He continued to take ships. He continued to manage his crew with the same combination of clear rules and genuine authority. He continued to dress well, maintain his habits, project the controlled competence of a man who believed himself to be exactly where he was supposed to be. But there is something in the historical record of this final period that is worth pausing over, something that feels, reading it carefully, like a man who has begun to understand that the story is approaching its conclusion. In the months before the final encounter, Roberts made several decisions that are difficult to explain in purely tactical terms. He spent time in port longer than operational necessity strictly required. He allowed his crew extended shore leave that, in earlier periods, he would have curtailed out of concern for security. He engaged in extended negotiations over certain captured vessels, negotiations that dragged on longer than his usual brisk efficiency would have countenanced. He wrote letters, several of them survive, to colonial officials, in a tone that mixed menace with something closer to reflection. One letter in particular, addressed to the governor of Barbados, reads less like a threat and more like a man making a record of his grievances for posterity, as though he understood that posterity was the audience that would ultimately matter. Captain Chelena Ogle arrived on the West African coast in late 1721 and spent the early weeks of 1722 conducting a systematic search of the coastline, moving methodically southward, gathering intelligence from coastal traders and fishing villages, following the patterns of Roberts' movements with the patient persistence of a man who understood that his quarry was not hiding, but simply working, and that sooner or later the work would bring them into the same piece of ocean. He also understood something critical about Roberts' situation that Roberts himself may not have fully appreciated, that the size of Roberts' fleet, which had been his greatest operational advantage, was now becoming a liability. A fleet of multiple large vessels required enormous quantities of provisions, water, and materials. Those requirements forced Roberts to approach the coast regularly, to send boats ashore, to anchor in known locations, to follow predictable patterns driven by logistical necessity rather than tactical preference. The same operational scale that had made Roberts nearly impossible to oppose in open water made him, in this final period, more trackable than he had ever been before. Ogle gathered this intelligence carefully. He noted the anchorages Roberts was known to favor. He identified the coastal trading posts that had supplied him. He mapped the seasonal patterns of wind and current that Roberts would need to respect in planning his movements. And then, in early February 1722, he received intelligence that brought everything into focus. Roberts was anchored at Cape Lopez on the Gabon coast. 3 ships, several hundred men. The Royal Fortune at the center of the anchorage, her guns run out, but her crew, by several accounts gathered afterward, not at the highest state of readiness. A celebration had taken place the previous night, following the capture of a Portuguese vessel. There had been drinking, considerable drinking, the kind of drinking that Roberts, with his tea and his discipline, had never been able to fully prevent when shore was close and prizes were fresh. Ogle considered his options. He had 1 ship of the line against 3 pirate vessels, one of which, the Royal Fortune, was heavily armed enough to be a genuine threat in open battle. A direct, immediate assault was possible, but its outcome was not certain. Roberts, even with a partially impaired crew, was a tactician of the first order, and a prepared Roberts in a defended anchorage could make HMS Swallow's mourning extremely costly. Ogle chose deception. He approached the anchorage in a way designed to suggest, to a distant observer, that he was a merchant vessel, adjusting his rigging and his course to mimic the profiles and movements of the kind of ship Roberts might wish to chase rather than flee from. He was betting that Roberts, or at least some portion of Roberts's fleet, might be drawn out of the anchorage in pursuit, that the same aggressive instinct that had made Roberts so effective might, in this moment, work against him. He was right. One of Roberts's accompanying vessels, a ship called the Ranger, under a captain named Skyam, took the bait. Seeing what appeared to be a promising merchant target moving along the coast, Skyam gave chase. HMS Swallow let him far enough from the anchorage that the sounds of the subsequent engagement would be partially obscured, then turned and fought. The battle was short and decisive. The Ranger was taken. Skyam was wounded and captured. And Ogle, his own ship now bearing the marks of the engagement but still fully operational, turned back toward Cape Lopez. Roberts had heard the distant gunfire. He knew something had happened. What exactly had happened, and to whom, was not yet clear. He made his assessment, as he always did, with the information available to him. He ordered the Royal Fortune prepared for action. It was the morning of February 10th, 1722. The sun was coming up over the West African coast. The ocean was calm, the light still low and golden on the water. Bartholomew Roberts dressed himself, as he always did before an engagement, with full deliberation. The damask coat, the weapons arranged precisely, the hat. He came up on deck and looked out at the approaching ship. HMS Swallow, flags now flying openly, disguise abandoned, running down toward the anchorage with the purposeful weight of a vessel that had found what it was looking for. The last morning of the golden age of piracy had begun. There are mornings in history that carry a different weight than the ones surrounding them. Mornings that arrive, ordinary in their mechanics, the sun rising in its usual arc, the birds moving in their usual patterns, the sea doing what the sea has always done, but that contain, unknown to almost everyone present, the hinge upon which enormous things will turn. The morning of February 10th, 1722, on the Gabon coast of West Africa, at a place called Cape Lopez, was such a morning, and Bartholomew Roberts, standing on the deck of the Royal Fortune and watching HMS Swallow come on through the early light, may have been the only man present who understood, with something approaching full clarity, exactly what kind of morning it was. He had lived 40 years as an ordinary man and 3 extraordinary ones. He had crossed oceans. He had built something unprecedented. He had demonstrated, at a scale no one before him had managed, what a single, disciplined and visionary mind could accomplish when it refused to accept the boundaries the world had drawn around it. He had taken more than 400 ships. He had humiliated governors and frightened admirals, and made the most powerful maritime empire in the world spend significant treasure and considerable political energy simply trying to find him. He had done all of this while drinking tea and writing constitutions and dressing, always like a man who expected the occasion to matter. And now, the occasion had arrived. Not in the form he might have chosen. Not on open water, with a fair wind and a fully rested crew and all the tactical advantages that his genius for positioning had so often secured him. It arrived instead on the morning after a celebration, with men still heavy-headed from the previous night's Portuguese wine, with one of his accompanying vessels already taken and the other, a ship called the Little Ranger, anchored at a distance that made rapid coordination difficult. It arrived in the form of Chaloner Ogle, competent and patient and possessed of a 50-gun warship that was, gun for gun, a match for the Royal Fortune in any honest accounting. Roberts made his assessment. He made it quickly, as he always had, and with the same fundamental clarity that had characterized every decision of his captaincy. The situation was not good. The Swallow was coming in hard, and running was not straightforwardly available. The wind, that morning, was not strongly in his favor for a clean escape, and the anchorage at Cape Lopez offered limited room for the kind of maneuvering that might create distance. He could fight at anchor, which gave him a stable gun platform but removed his mobility entirely, or he could get the Royal Fortune moving, make sail and attempt to pass the Swallow, take whatever damage that passage cost him, and break for open water where his options expanded. He chose movement. He ordered the anchor cable cut, not raised, cut, because raising took time he did not have, and the Royal Fortune began to make sail. The plan, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of survivors, was to attempt to run past the Swallow on a close course, exchanging broadsides as they passed, and reach open water before Ogle could bring his full weight of guns to bear in a sustained engagement. It was an aggressive, high-risk choice. It was, characteristically, the choice of a man who believed that boldness was always preferable to passivity, that the initiative was worth whatever it cost to maintain. For a few minutes, perhaps 15, perhaps 20, the accounts vary. It seemed like it might work. The Royal Fortune was a large and powerful vessel, and in the hands of men who knew her, she moved with a responsiveness that spoke to months of accumulated maintenance and intimate operational knowledge. Roberts himself was at the quarterdeck, directing the course, watching the Swallow's angle of approach with the focused attention of a man running through calculations that had no margin for error. And then the grape shot came. Grape shot was the close-quarters ammunition of the era, not a single heavy ball designed to penetrate hull planking, but a cluster of smaller iron balls packed together and discharged from a cannon in a spreading, scything pattern designed to clear the exposed personnel of an enemy deck. At close range, it was among the most lethal things the age of sail had to offer, and the Swallow, closing the distance with Ogle's characteristic methodical determination, fired a broadside that swept the Royal Fortune's deck with precisely that effect. Bartholomew Roberts was struck. A cluster of grape shot at close range tore into his throat. He died almost immediately. He was standing at his quarterdeck when it happened, at the most exposed position on the ship, where the captain of a vessel in his tradition was expected to be, where the men around him could see him and draw from his presence whatever steadiness they needed. He died, by every account, without theatrics, without a speech. He simply ceased, between one moment and the next, to be standing. His body was caught by a sailor named Stevenson, who had served with him for months, and who, in the immediate aftermath of what had just happened, is reported to have wept. The accounts of what followed have a quality of almost unbearable poignancy. Roberts had told his men, at some earlier point, the timing is uncertain, but the instruction appears in multiple independent accounts that he did not wish to be taken. not wounded and captured, not paraded before a naval court and hanged in the approved manner. His body afterward displayed in chains as a warning at some colonial harbor entrance, as was the custom with executed pirates. He had made his wishes on this subject plain enough that the men who had been with him longest understood them as something closer to an order than a preference. They wrapped him in his sail. They gathered the weights that would carry him down, and before the Swallow could close the remaining distance, before Challoner Ogle could reach the Royal Fortune and claim the prize that he had crossed an ocean to find, they committed Bartholomew Roberts to the sea, to the element that had defined the last 3 years of his life, that had been the theater of everything he had built and everything he had done. They gave him to it whole, dressed as he always dressed, in his coat, in his weapons, with whatever remained of his extraordinary dignity intact. The ocean received him. He went down in waters off the coast of West Africa, somewhere near Cape Lopez, in a depth that has never been precisely established, and a location that has never been precisely found. He was approximately 40 years old. He had been a pirate for less than 3 years. The Royal Fortune struck her colors shortly afterward. Without Roberts, without the specific weight of his presence on that deck, the fight went out of what remained of the crew with a speed that speaks to how completely the enterprise had been, in the deepest sense, a product of one man's will. They were still armed. They still had guns. But Bartholomew Roberts was gone, and the thing that had made those guns feel like the instruments of something larger than mere survival or greed was gone with him. Challoner Ogle took the ship. He took the surviving crew. He tallied his prize money, which was considerable and which would eventually earn him a knighthood, making him the only Royal Navy officer to be knighted specifically for actions against pirates. He wrote his report to the Admiralty in the measured, professional language of a man who had accomplished a difficult assignment competently and wished the record to reflect as much. He noted the death of Roberts. He noted the capture of the fleet. He was, by all indications, satisfied. What happened next, in the weeks and months following Cape Lopez, was a coda to the battle that was, in its own way, as historically significant as the battle itself. Ogle transported the captured men, more than 200 of them, drawn from across the Atlantic world, to Cape Coast Castle, a British trading fort on the Gold Coast of West Africa, where they were tried in what became one of the largest piracy trials in history. The proceedings were swift by modern standards, which is to say brutal. The evidence was abundant, the legal framework was clear, and the outcomes were, for the majority of the men involved, lethal. 52 men were hanged. Their bodies, following the established custom, were displayed in chains at various points along the West African coast, at Cape Coast Castle, at Corso Castle, at points visible from the sea lanes that Roberts had once dominated, as warnings to other sailors who might be entertaining similar ambitions. 37 men were imprisoned or sentenced to terms of forced labor. 70 men, Africans who had been aboard the pirate vessels, many of them originally enslaved people who had joined Roberts' crew either voluntarily or by compulsion, were sold back into slavery, which stands as one of the darker ironies in a story that contains more than a few. The trial records from Cape Coast Castle are remarkable historical documents. The depositions of the accused, the testimonies of captured merchant sailors, the legal arguments made by the Admiralty judges, all of it survives in archives in London and elsewhere, and together it constitutes the most detailed portrait we have of what life aboard Roberts' ships actually looked like from the inside. Men who had lived under his articles, eaten at his tables, sailed under his flags, described, with varying degrees of willingness, what it had been to be part of the enterprise he had built. Their accounts are not uniformly admiring. Some resented the articles. Some had wanted to leave and found it difficult. Some had joined under compulsion and never fully accepted what they had become. But running through almost all of the testimonies, even the most hostile ones, is a consistent thread. A sense that Roberts himself had been something apart, something that exceeded the ordinary categories available for thinking about men in his position. They described his discipline. They described his fairness within the specific and bounded world that his articles had created. They described his composure in battle and his authority in council, and the particular quality of his attention when he was examining a problem, the focused, unhurried quality of a man who trusted his own mind and had learned over long experience that the mind was usually worth trusting. They described, without quite having the language for it, a leader. He was gone, but the world he had moved through was permanently changed by his passage through it. The death of Roberts at Cape Lopez is widely regarded by historians as the effective end of the golden age of piracy. This is not simply a symbolic designation. The practical reality was that Roberts had been, in his final years, the organizing principle around which much of the remaining pirate activity of the era had oriented itself, not formally, not through any acknowledged hierarchy, but in the way that a very large and very successful operation creates a gravitational field that other, smaller operations move within. His death removed that center of gravity. The trial and execution of his crew removed a significant proportion of the remaining experienced pirates operating in the Atlantic theater. The naval precedent established by Ogle's campaign that the Royal Navy would pursue pirates to West Africa, would allocate real warships and real resources to the task, would not be satisfied with merely driving pirates out of one region and allowing them to reconstitute elsewhere, created a deterrent effect that persisted long after the immediate campaign concluded. Other pirates would operate in subsequent years and decades. Piracy itself would never fully disappear from the oceans, but the specific phenomenon that historians mean when they speak of the Golden Age, that 30-year window of extraordinary, organized, philosophically self-conscious maritime outlawry, ended on a February morning off the coast of West Africa, when a cluster of grape shot found Bartholomew Roberts at his quarterdeck, and the most successful pirate who ever lived gave the sea one last instruction: take me whole, take me dressed, take me before they can claim me. The sea obeyed. It always had. History remembers loudly the men who built empires and quietly the men who refused them. Bartholomew Roberts refused one, and then, almost incidentally, built something that in its brief, extraordinary life contained more genuine democratic principle than most of the governments that sent warships to destroy it. This is the paradox at the center of his story. A man who operated entirely outside the law, who plundered, who terrorized, who disrupted the commerce of nations, and who simultaneously constructed, aboard his ships, a society more equitable, more transparent, and more responsive to the needs of ordinary men than virtually anything the legitimate world of his era had to offer. His articles guaranteed compensation for injury at a time when the Royal Navy offered none. His elections held captains accountable at a time when naval law made captains nearly untouchable. His written contracts made the distribution of reward predictable and fair at a time when merchant sailors routinely died in poverty after decades of service. We do not need to romanticize this. The violence was real. The victims were real. The merchants whose livelihoods were destroyed, the sailors whose ships were taken, the people caught in the machinery of an enterprise that ran ultimately on fear. Their suffering does not dissolve, because the man responsible for it kept good records and dressed well. Roberts was not a hero. He was something more complicated and therefore more interesting than a hero. He was a man of exceptional ability who was born into a world that had no legitimate place for that ability, who found a place for it anyway, and who in doing so revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, the gap between what the established order claimed to offer and what it actually provided to the men at the bottom of it. The sailors who signed his articles were not, for the most part, wicked men seeking wickedness. They were working men who had looked at two options and chosen the one that treated them better. That choice tells us something about the options. What is perhaps most enduring about Roberts What gives his story its particular staying power across 3 centuries is not the number of ships he took, or the oceans he crossed, or the governments he frightened. It is the quality of his attention, the sense, present in everything he did, that he had thought carefully about the life he was living and chosen it consciously. He did not drift into piracy. He did not tumble into it in a moment of desperation or weakness. He assessed the world as it was, weighed it against what he believed he deserved and was capable of, and made a decision. He lived by that decision with a consistency and a discipline that most people, in any era, in any profession, never managed to sustain. There is something quietly instructive in that, not in the piracy itself, not in the violence or the lawlessness, but in the underlying posture, the refusal to accept, without examination, the life that circumstance had initially assigned him, the insistence that a man's capabilities ought to determine the shape of his days, the conviction that fairness, even in the most unlikely environments, was worth building and worth defending. The ocean off Cape Lopez has kept his secret for 300 years. No wreck has ever been conclusively identified as the Royal Fortune. No grave marks the place where Bartholomew Roberts went into the water. The coast of West Africa holds him still, in the deep, cold, lightless places where the Atlantic shelf drops away and the sea becomes something older and more permanent than any of the human stories played out on its surface. But the story itself remains, in the trial records at Cape Coast Castle, in the dispatches of frightened governors, in the articles he wrote, which some historians have read as the earliest articulation of rights that would take the rest of the world another century to begin formally acknowledging, in the 400 ships that went into his logbook, each one a data point in the most remarkable maritime career the age of sail ever produced. He was born in a small Welsh village. He went to sea young. He became, by a sequence of circumstances and choices, the most successful pirate in history. He died on a February morning, dressed as he always dressed, having refused to the very end to be anything other than precisely what he had decided to be. The sea took him. The sea keeps him, and somewhere in that deep water, perfectly still, perfectly unhurried, the most organized man in the history of piracy is right at home,